Starting here. Good morning. I'm Dr. Hazel Green Young. I'm a radiologist in the University Hospitals of Cleveland Regional Radiology Practice. I came to Cleveland in 1979 as a diagnostic radiology resident here at University Hospitals. I'm not a historian or an epidemiologist. The opinions expressed are my own. My subject is what's the matter with Black people? Now that's kind of a provocative title, and I arrived at this title because over the years, many white people, maybe a few Blacks, I don't know, have asked me, what's the matter with Black people? Now that's not something anybody can easily answer. I think you could, if you're in discussions with someone, maybe you could spend hours talking about it. I'm only going to spend about 30 minutes. So when people ask that question, what I think they're asking me is, why are there these persistent racial gaps? And the gaps consist mainly of what we call the health gaps or disparities. We talk about the wealth gaps, and then we talk about the achievement gaps. So it's been well documented and has been persistently shown that Blacks tend to have less wealth than white Americans. Black Americans have less, there's an achievement gap between Black and white. And there's a wealth gap. Here we refer to it. So, and the health gaps and the health disparities are pretty much everything. So we have a lower life expectancy, we have poor outcomes with cancers, we have poor outcomes with COVID. These have all been written about extensively. So let's start at slavery. That's pretty much where I can trace my family back to. So to me, slavery is the ultimate racism. To enslave a group of people, you have to believe that they're innately inferior and convince yourself that you're doing them a favor by enslaving them. In addition, for example, if you're beating your slaves, you have to convince yourself that they do not feel pain or not as much pain as white people. Another situation is where if you are willing to separate women from their children, break up families, you have to convince yourself that families are not as important to them as they are to you. So slavery existed in this country legally from 1619 to 1865, which is a period of 246 years. And I think we started out with indentured servants who could be Black or white. But I think at some point someone figured out, well, if we just enslave Black people, they're easily identifiable, and hence it's easier to keep them enslaved. They cannot easily flee. So now my great-great-grandfather was Ben Green. He was from Jones County, Georgia. He had a child, my great-grandfather, Thomas Green, by his slave, Betty. When you have a child by a slave, that baby automatically becomes a slave. Now, why does this happen? Well, it was very common for white slave owners to have sex and children by Black female slaves. Why this happened? One is perhaps just garden variety rape. There are also obviously economic opportunities, because if you have more slaves, the slaves have monetary value. So you could enrich yourself by having slaves, more slaves by your female slaves. And then there are certainly some love matches. So one of the famous love matches was between another white slave owner from Jones County, Georgia. That would be Michael Morris Healy. Michael Morris Healy had a long-term relationship, a family relationship with his slave, Mary Eliza. The two of them had multiple children. One of his sons, Patrick Francis Healy, became the first Black president of a predominantly white institution. That institution is Georgetown University. Now, the interesting thing about that is that in 2017, Georgetown University made a public apology for selling 272 of their slaves downriver to plantations in New Orleans. What I found interesting about the apology is it seemed like they were only apologizing for selling those slaves. I did not notice that there was an apology for owning them or buying them in the first place. So the Jesuits, which includes Georgetown University, had a plantation in Maryland where they had more than 1,000 slaves at one time. Other love matches resulted in large numbers of white slave owners moving their multiracial families out of the South where they could have a better and safer life. So there were many communities with these multiracial families, including Wilberforce, Ohio. So starting in slavery, you could see the beginnings of a wealth gap. For example, the white slave owners and the non-slave white people or other white people had the potential to make money. Slaves did not have that potential to make money. Then you can also see where there could be a beginning of an achievement gap. White people were allowed to be educated. It was against the law for slaves to be educated. So while some people were going to Harvard, my Black relatives were picking cotton. So people say, oh, slavery's over. It's been over a long time. What's the matter with Black people? Why are we still talking about this? And why are we still blaming everything on slavery? Well, because after slavery, things did not suddenly overnight become wonderful for Black people. So they had the Jim Crow laws from approximately 1870 to 1960s, where there was segregation was the law of the land in terms of housing, education, voting rights, et cetera, et cetera. And then there were lynchings. Lynchings was a very common practice to try and keep Black people in their place. Places like Georgia were really big on lynching. But I feel that to some extent we still have lynchings. Now it's more in the law enforcement where on a daily basis it seems that Black men are being killed by policemen. Also after slavery, they had what they call convict leasing, where the South in need of workers, which have been freed from many of their jobs, would randomly arrest Black men and put them in jail, incarcerate them, and then farm them out to industries in need of workers. Part of that situation was worse than slavery because they frequently sent them out to dangerous jobs. And since they no longer had the monetary value that they had in slavery, nobody cared if they got killed. In slavery, if you killed a slave owner's child or slave, you would have to reimburse him for the cost of that slave. With convict leasing, since they did not belong to anybody, then they could be killed and without consequence. Also developed after slavery was a process called slave sharecropping. So frequently, a lot of freed slaves and their descendants would work on the plantation of their previous owner or father or other white plantation owners. And the purpose was, the original idea was that they would work and make money, but it was set up in a way that they could be cheated out of their earnings and basically still be enslaved and indebted to the landowner. The other thing that happened after slavery was significant voter suppression. They did not want Black people to vote. They would lynch you if you tried to vote. They would threaten you, run you out of town, all sorts of things to discourage Black people from voting. These communities where they had the largest number of slaves also had the largest percentage of Blacks. So in those days, it was easier for a Black to get elected, or a non-racist white perhaps. So voter suppression was a way to keep Black people from progressing politically and otherwise. So as a result of all these horrible things, there was what they called the Great Migration, where large numbers of Black Americans fled the South to the North. I'm sure also some white people left because the economy was not in very good shape after the Civil War. So during the Great Migration, my great-grandfather, who was a slave for the 1 year, he was born in 1864, and his family, which included his wife, who was an ex-slave, and his sister, who was an ex-slave, and my grandfather and his family, they moved to Detroit, Michigan. So when they moved to Detroit, there was hope that things would be better. Unfortunately, they ran up against a lot of other systemic and community walls, you could say. One was called redlining. Many cities in the North set up redlining where Blacks could only live on one side and the whites lived on the other side. So if you wanted to buy or build a house, if you're a Black, you had to go to the one side of the red line. Unfortunately, many of these communities that Blacks were allowed to live in were areas where they had a lot of industrial pollution. So then you had problems with the air, you had problems with the water. So for example, I have family who lived in Flint, Michigan, or who still live in the Flint community. And they had, not that long ago, the lead in the water. The lead in the water obviously is not a good thing. It creates all kind of physical and mental problems. My brother-in-law died at age 43 in Flint, Michigan, possibly related to this water crisis. In addition, when Black Americans tried to buy houses, banks did not typically want to loan to Black people. And as recent as today, the banks have been found that charge Blacks a significantly higher interest rate to get a mortgage. So Blacks are living in houses that they were told, areas where they were told they could live, trying to have a life, but many communities would destroy these communities. They would tear down the Black communities, such as Black Bottom, where my mother lived in Detroit, and put a freeway such as I-75 right through where the Black communities used to be. Some other communities, such as like in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where you had a thriving middle-class community, they would just burn it down and, kill people, kill Black people. Then there was a Social Security Index, or the Social Security Law of 1935. That was set up so that people could save for retirement, a very good way to establish wealth. But what they did was they excluded deliberately many professions or occupations that were largely included Black people, such as sharecropping and domestic work. Later, there was the GI Bill of 1944. Again, a very good way to establish some wealth and some achievement by providing educational opportunities and training opportunities for veterans. However, again, as we've seen many times, this was not afforded to Black American veterans. Then there was medical experimentation. There was Dr. Mims, I think, or Sims, I'm sorry. I have a mental block against his name, and I have a hard time accepting him as a fellow physician. Anyway, he practiced surgery on slave females. He did this frequently without anesthesia, and subsequently he would perfect his technique and then apply it to white women. This was the beginnings of the whole notion that, or a continuation of the notion that Black people don't feel pain. So during slavery, you had to say they didn't feel pain to justify or feel okay with beating them. And then we had this so-called doctor doing what I considered butchery. This idea of Black people not feeling pain still continues to this day. I've heard that medical students are still sometimes being taught that Black people don't feel pain like white people feel pain. Recently, my husband and I went to the same dentist to have the same procedure. My husband who's Chinese, was offered narcotics. I was not. When I asked my doctor, this dentist, why there was a discrepancy, his response was, well, your husband is a weenie. And again, that struck me as being racist. I'll let you think about it. So then there was state-sponsored eugenics from 1907 to 1963. This is where the United States allowed women of color, mostly women of color, and girls to be sterilized without their permission. My grandfather from Georgia had multiple sisters, none of whom had children, many of whom we think were victimized by this eugenics. And then there are the Tuskegee experiments that many people have heard about. This was from 1932 to 1972. This is where the United States Health Service allowed Tuskegee Alabama health professionals to experiment by watching untreated syphilis patients to see what the results would be long-term. So after they had penicillin to treat it easily, they refused to provide it to these patients. These patients were frequently not as well educated, maybe sharecroppers, maybe poor, and they were told they were getting free health care. So in addition to the mortality and morbidity that these men faced, undoubtedly there were also consequences for their wives and their children. In 1953, the US Atomic Commission allowed experimentation on babies in Detroit, where I am from. At Harper Hospital, where 4 of my younger sisters were born, they would give radioactive iodine to the babies and try to see if there was a difference between giving it to full-term babies versus premature babies. I was born at Burton Mercy Hospital, as an aside. It was a Black hospital founded by a Dr. DeWitt Burton, a Black man, because at that time, in many places, Blacks and Black doctors, Black patients had to go to a different hospital. So moving on about healthcare, sometimes I feel like they cared less or got less. And certainly sometimes we didn't get any care, or we got bad care, or we got different care. Some examples of different care, we had Dr. Quinn Capers, originally from Cleveland, Ohio, now practicing in Texas. He came here and spoke to us, and he talked about how if a Black man had peripheral vascular disease, he was more likely to get an amputation than a revascular procedure than a white patient with the same condition. In the book Under the Skin by Linda Villarosa, which talks about healthcare disparities, mentions that a Black man with prostate cancer was more likely to be castrated as a treatment than white men with the same disease. There is limited or less than optimal mental health care for Black people and brown people and poor people. They say that the amount of mental health issues are similar in Black and white people in America. To be honest, I find that hard to believe, because all the indignities we've suffered over 500 years would suggest that in addition to having physical problems as a result, you might have some mental ones. Which brings me to weathering. Weathering is a process whereby it is suspected or studied or shown that persistent racism prematurely ages people on a cellular level. So some of the health disparities are felt to be not just because of difference in treatment or quality of care, but because the Black body has suffered insults. So for example, if you have a 20-year-old Black woman having a baby, the physiologic response of her body may be more like that of a 40-year-old white woman. What they found with weathering is it doesn't matter, because another thing is, you want to blame, we tend to want to blame the victim or say, well, it's poverty or lack of education. They've shown that a college-educated Black woman has worse outcomes with maternal morbidity and mortality than a white woman who has not yet finished high school. There's the GFR, glomerular filtration rate, that measures how well your kidneys function. Now, for most of my training, I've noticed that they had a different value for Black people and white people. I didn't understand why. I didn't investigate it, but some enterprising Black woman medical student at University of Washington a couple years ago investigated, and what they found was it was just based on racism. So what apparently they were doing was normalizing abnormal renal function in Black people. And by doing that, the Black patients were deprived of appropriate care for their declining renal function. They were also deprived of being planted on a transplant list. Then there's ACE, which is adverse childhood events. So what they have found is that when children are exposed to traumatic things, it impacts their health long-term. So for example, if they're exposed to violence, if they're exposed to family members with mental illness, these can have long-term effects. And as you know, last week we had a major adverse childhood event at a school in Tennessee. So we get the education and achievement gap. So limited opportunities, suboptimal education, and biases. As I mentioned, slaveries, the laws were that Blacks could not learn, could not be taught, it was against the law. After slavery, we frequently did not have schools available to teach Black people. The Brown versus Board of Education decided that the Supreme Court decided that that segregated education was inherently unequal and therefore became against the law. It was no longer legal. So the white community responses this was to start their own white academies. When they did that, they sometimes would strip the public schools of all its resources, books, whatever, and then establish their white academies. And in their white academies, the state sometimes diverted taxpayer money to the academies to the benefit of the white students. This is another area where you can see where a gap may have started and still continues to this day, because now what we have is taxpayer money in the form of vouchers going to private, charter, and religious schools. So in education, bias and racism. So my daughters, when they went to high school, one not too long ago, they were, one day the younger daughter came home and said, "Mama, my teacher did not recommend me for the highest of the next level math class." And I don't know why that happened, because I know for a fact Johnny had lower grades than I did. So I thought about it and I said to my daughter, I said, your teacher may not have high expectations for a petite woman of color. So if you want to take this class, you can take the class. So my daughter signed up for the class, but we had to sign a waiver. The school said, if we don't follow their recommendations, then we're on our own. They're not going to help us. Well, my daughter did fine. And my husband went to the parent-teacher conference and spoke with the teacher and said to her, well, you didn't recommend my daughter take this class. And the teacher said, oh, no, that's not true. Certainly I did. So this is the problem with bias. We all have bias. I mean, I flunked the Harvard implicit bias test. The problem is when we make no effort or have no motivation to understand our biases so that we don't work in a way with our biases to the detriment of someone else, including patients in medicine. There is the idea of stereotype threat. There was a book written by Claude Steele, formerly of Stanford University, where he talked about stereotypes. So the stereotypes are pretty much known throughout the world about Black people, for example. The stereotypes about Black Americans are they're not too smart, they're lazy, they're not motivated, they don't care about their kids, and so probably we don't feel pain. So when a Black student is in a position to take a test where they think someone is judging whether they are smart or not, or kind of like an IQ test, this impacts their ability to perform to their natural capabilities. So they will perform less well than they should be able to. There's the opposite idea called stereotype boost. So if you come from a community where you're always told you're brilliant, that your community people are more intelligent than everybody else, put in a position, for example, like a test, you might actually outperform your innate ability just because you have come to believe that you're more brilliant than everybody else. So I don't know where that puts my daughters. They're Black and they're Chinese, who knows? Why can't Johnny read? Why Johnny can't read? That was the name of a book back maybe in the 80s. I don't think I ever read the book. It was about phonetics. One of the few things I'm not somewhat interested in, probably. But I think of it in terms of why might there be this achievement gap? Well, let's take Johnny. Let's say Johnny is a Black student. And let's say Johnny's father is in jail because he was arrested for having a small amount of illegal drugs. Let's say Johnny lost his mother last year because she died in childbirth. Let's say Johnny's brother was killed by the police, and Johnny may have cognitive impairment and behavioral issues because there was lead in his water. Okay, we're moving right along here. Let's talk about success. So in America, success is important. That's why we have all these metrics: who's the smartest, who's the wealthiest, who's achieving the most. The thing is, many people think I'm wonderful because I work so hard, because I'm so brilliant. That's why I am where I am. Well, what I tell people, because you know I like to talk, I'm frequently saying things. I tell people there's one thing, the most important thing that determines your potential outcome that you have no control over is who your parents are. So then after many years of denying admission to Black students to places of higher learning, from like schools at Harvard and University of North Carolina, for example, they decided to institute a policy where they would try to increase the number of Black students. So this happened in the 60s and 70s. And for a while, it seemed to work. Schools were getting an increasing number of Black students. Things were looking very promising. However, things changed. It evolved to a point where a lot of times, most of the students, a large percentage of students getting into these higher institutions were legacies, and legacies are more likely to include white people. While my family was picking cotton and sharecropping, someone else's grandfather, great-grandfather might have been at Harvard, and therefore their descendants are more likely going to benefit from legacy. In addition, a lot of women have benefited. There are many more women sometimes are going to college, and some colleges are larger percent women than men. And more recently, when institutions are trying to increase their number of Black students or employees, they preferentially choose immigrant Blacks. Microaggressions, macroaggressions, living while Black, walking while Black, eating Skittles while Black. Black people can tell you stories about microaggressions in their daily lives. One time I got a survey from Case Western or University Hospitals it was supposed to be anonymous, but they asked me how often did I think about race? And I said, well, why are they asking me that if this is anonymous? But anyway, I think I said I think about it every moment of every day. So for example, my colleagues had a holiday party. And I was there with my colleagues and their family, and one of the spouses came up to me and asked me where the restroom was. Because the stereotype is that a Black person can't be equal to your husband or yourself. So therefore they must be the maintenance people or housekeepers or something along those lines. My daughters were frequently told when they're in school that they must be smart because their father was Chinese, or that it was good their father was Chinese to make up for having a Black mother. And this is kind of the life that some minorities live. Okay, getting towards the end. Is there hope? Or actually, this is the end. Can we close the gap? Can we extinguish racism and bias? Racism is not going anywhere. What I think is all we can do is try and accept our biases, acknowledge our biases, and try not to act on them to the detriment of other people in our community and in our places of work. Dr. Banerjee from Harvard University, PhD from Ohio State, gave a presentation at Baldwin Wallace a couple years ago talking about bias. And she showed a graph at the end of her talk that showed that America was having increased acceptance of the LGBTQ community, but the needle had not moved at all for anti-Black racism. Then there's a book by Jonathan Metzl. I think I missed a slide, but anyway, there was a book by Jonathan Metzl. He's from Vanderbilt University. He might be speaking for our grand rounds in a couple months. This book, he researched red states. So red states is kind of a political term for conservative states. So when the Affordable Care Act was instituted by President Barack Obama, some of the states, mostly red states, many red states, where they still have large Black populations left over from continuation from the days of slavery. And he asked Black people, how would you feel about health care for all? And Black people, by and large, thought this was a wonderful idea. Many of the white people he interviewed said, in effect, they would rather die than share resources with brown and Black people. So when Dr. Metzel spoke at University of Akron, at the end of his talk, I asked him, is there any hope? If you're willing to die because of your beliefs, because of your racist or your white identification, is there any hope? I think he didn't think necessarily that there was any hope. But like I say, I'm trying to be optimistic, and I'm trying to think that if there's something Black people can do, there's something white people can do, I think we're all in this together. We have to work together, and Asian people and other minorities. I think that'll be the subject maybe of my next talk. So thank you. This is a picture of my lovely family. This is my single daughter, if anybody's looking for a spouse. And this is a picture, this is a piece of art I bought in Cuba last year by a Black artist who formerly was an X-ray tech. So a lot of his photographs incorporate skeletons. It's kind of morbid, but I just couldn't resist it as a radiologist. Are there any questions? These are some of the references. So what do I do to turn it off? I assume it's, oh, here it is. It just showed up. I'll stop recording.